Hello everyone, welcome to your lecture on media and women activism. This lecture is a part of your paper on gender, media and society. This lecture will look into how media may influence women activism and vice versa. According to Rao, the historic phenomenon of subordination of women has been the very condition by which society existed, and hence the imposed inferiority of women has been invisible. The lower status of women in society is thought out to be expected, and this has happened from the idea of the patriarchal social pattern that the cause of lopsided association between the sexes is physically determined and not within the influence of societal changes. The function and position of all members of society is determined in relation to the requirements of the dominant group, and generally these are males. Hence, the disparity in sexes has allocated the same disparities in gender role. Women are supposed to raise children, take care of domestic matters, whereas males make their livelihood outside the home. This emphasis on two spheres, one public for the men and another private for the women, has led to gross disparities between the two. Women activism. Gangopadhyay opined that women movements across the world have stemmed from some historical events or great happenings in society. Diverse social forces and political uprisings have led to women's struggle in the Western countries. In most of the third world countries, women movements and struggles from colonial rule happened simultaneously. The Indian freedom struggle against the colonial regime saw large participation of women who came out of the confines of their homes and played a pivotal role alongside their male counterparts. Women's movements got a lot of impetus from the freedom struggle. This also acted as a catalyst for rapid spread of awakening among Indian women, along with the positive influence of social reformers. In the end of 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, foundation of various associations and organizations was laid to improve the scenario of female education, to train women to be economically independent and provide shelter to destitute women. With freedom from colonial rule in 1947 in India, women have secured equal status with men as embodied in the Constitution of Free India, which has been made possible due to women's movements. However, after independence, most women have voluntarily moved back into their normal domain, that is, the home. Though some have been actively involved in education, healthcare, and social service, while very few have even chosen a political life. This has been a natural process as the freedom struggle has been able to inadvertently overshadow women's movements for personal freedom. According to Luthra, after the period of nationalism, a little progress was observed in the movement for social elevation of women's status. Apart from women taking active part in militant sharecroppers movement like the 1948 to 50 movement of Telangana in the state of Andhra Pradesh and the anti-colonial agitation in the Uttarakhand area in the early 60s, meager amount of activity was done in the domain of women's rights. United Nations. The year 1945 witnessed the establishment of UN, that is, the United Nations. A new era dawned to spread awareness regarding situation of women worldwide. The UN Charter upholds the equality of men and women in all fields of activity. In 1967, the UN General Assembly approved the UN Declaration of Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. However, in spite of the efforts to bring the sufferings of women in the limelight, there has been disparity between men and women. UN acknowledged 1975 as the International Year for Women and the subsequent period, that is 1975 to 85, as the Decade for Women. This Decade for Women saw two major achievements in the form of two UN bodies exclusively for women. The UNIFEM, or the United Nations Development Fund for Women, which funds new and novel developmental activities which can benefit women mostly in rural areas of developing countries, and INSTRAW, which is International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women, which envisages larger participation of women in economic, political and social spheres. The implementation of UN CEDAW, or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, in the year 1979 has been a milestone in females' human rights all over the world. NGOs. The worldwide movement for women's rights have really gained momentum from the entry of women NGOs, non-governmental organizations, which have suitably carried on various programs on the advancement of women in society. The women groups have been active all over the world. Their activities range from protest marches, meetings, workshops and conferences, along with related fieldwork. The visible forms and activities like protest marches, sit-in demonstrations and large-scale meetings are normally brought to public notice by the mass media. However, the coverage in media of women's groups has been insufficient in most cases and often ignored and sometimes even derided. This has been the case from the early phase of women's movements worldwide. Anderson discusses about the efforts of Edward P. Morgan's What Really Happened to the 1960s, how mass media culture failed American democracy. Which is apprehensive with the cutting off amongst social protesters and the media that effects in typecasts and distortions of activist values. Here's for the media's effect on our present understanding of the rightist decade to detect the enduring influences of the mass media's capability to form public judgment of the social activities of the 60s. Here he speaks on how the media tosses the focus onto specific characteristics of a campaign while disregarding others. As Gitlin points out, the media divide movements into legitimate main acts and illegitimate sideshows so that these distinctions appear natural matters of common sense. The idea of real female emancipation has arisen in India only in the 1970s. The autonomous women's groups emerged in the Indian scenario in the late 70s and came of age in the early 80s. These have been mainly responsible in pushing the cloistered and domestic sphere into the arena of the public, highlighting issues of women. In the beginning, they have concentrated on violence on women, as these issues affect women from all walks of life. But they have also organized demonstrations, protest marches, general campaigns. They have been successful in attracting eclectic support of political parties for various issues on which they have campaigned and been able to make an impact on public life. According to Charco, widespread demonstrations, protests and extended campaigns challenged gender bias at its core. This was not only limited to state institutions like judiciary and social institutions like family, community or media, but also in progressive political parties who have failed to give due importance to women's questions. Media sometimes publicize serious issues related to problems and prospects of women. Luthra opined, the Indian English press has been an important instrument in bringing the issues of the urban Indian women's movement into the public discourse and in influencing legislation on women's issues. It is therefore important to look at the relationship between the press and the women's movements in India. Morris felt that media definitions tend to go for the reform image of the movement rather than the revolutionary one. However, providing less coverage to women's movements in the media is not always an intentional ploy. These movements are not generally considered within the ambit of major parameters of important events. According to different experts, the urban women's movements in India have been successful in publicizing various women's issues through the press, including dowry-related murders, rapes, selective abortions of female fetuses, etc. The reporting of women's concerns in the Indian media progressively amplified in the 1980s due to labor of females groups beside other enterprising groups. As Joseph and Sharma said, although the Indian press has been amenable to publishing stories on women's issues, it has often chosen to concentrate on the sensational and political aspects of the issues rather than the larger implications in terms of gender. As Gallagher reiterates that women's campaign in media have represented a very important part in women's labor across the globe, the same holds true in today's times. They have empowered women to connect in their individual words and imageries through global networking, consciousness raising, and knowledge creation. Excepting print and publication, which are the mostly used compositions, other forms of media like radio, film, music, video, and other newly emerging technologies of communication also played a very substantial role in the previous 2 decades. The similar period also observed an unchanging advancement in media relations and linkages of women and growing number of working women in conventional media. Joseph and Sharma felt that different women's groups campaigning against rape, sexual harassment and domestic violence against Indian women resulted in an increased coverage of these incidents by mass media. The increase in the number of senior women journalists has had a noticeable impact on women-related subjects. Media has both aided and devoted space and time for propagation of different issues related to women by women activists. As Luthra points out, that the press of India adapted the activists' language and made it suitable for the readers. They also highlighted specific features of the movement upon others to suit agreement of news. In totality, it reflected on the activists' individual explanations of the topics, and in the process, it didn't present a risk to the greater hegemonic structure. This was consummated partially by careful usage of certain features of the movement and somewhat due to the point that activists framing the issue set aside the contradictory relations between the movements of women and the state and the exclusive nature of the women's movement in India. However, this has not been an unmixed blessing, as Gangopadhyay finds out, that ideas of women's empowerment have been spread through the mass media, with the media providing space for all kinds of images of women in society. Women organizations, to their credit, have been able to persuade the media to report on crimes against women. However, media has been sensational at times, and at times have been too brief while reporting on an issue. It is to the credit of media, though, that these incidents have been analyzed in editorials, commented upon by experts, and followed up. Women activists joining the mass media as journalists have also helped, as they have tried to highlight these issues. The discussion on women activism and media would remain incomplete if the role of the digital online media is not taken into account in relation to its use by women activists. Gangopadhyay said, "Digital technology has ridden the wave of globalization and has become available in most places around the world. With digital technology being used in almost all spheres, from social, economic to political spheres. The social networking sites have not just linked two individuals in a very intimate interpersonal communication, but also has successfully connected people to form groups and forums ranging from political to social issue representations." Lopes felt that the introduction of social media such as blogs, Facebook and Twitter as a new way to social network has become the new catalyst tool in the formation of social movements. Subramaniam feels that digital technology has helped in continuation of the process in online spaces. A sense of community feeling is developed among women when there is an avenue to connect with feminist networks across the world. Digital technology also provides a space to those whose voices are not heard on mainstream media narratives. Digital technology has helped in redefining a feminist activist by opening up spaces that encourage intersectional dialogues due to its democratic potential. It helps in the formation of feminist public spheres, where voices of the marginalized sections can be heard. Digital technology has helped women to form networks of solidarity and become part of different groups to raise consciousness while maintaining a state of anonymity. Definitions of feminist activism need to be broadened to include interventions that can question and redefine the relationship between gender and technology in a context where technology is associated with masculinity. Studies need to be undertaken of the initiatives that address the exclusion of women from technology. As digital democracy and realization of equal access remains one of the topmost concerns, digital technology has the ability to give rise to feminist public sphere. Gallagher feels that the building of such alliances and the merging of women's diverse experiences of working with and in the media is surely one of the most urgent tasks for women struggling for a more diverse and democratic world information and communication system. Joseph and Sharma opine that while the press in India does not entirely ignore women's events or processes concerning the less powerful, including women, such coverage tends, by and large, to be fairly superficial. women's groups in India have been able to project at least parts of their struggle fairly effectively through the press. Anderson opined that social movements and media researchers have established that movement campaigners have constantly sensed that a story of activism has been somewhat lost in translation when portrayed through media. Allen pointed out that there is a need to close the gap between those who have shaped systems outside conventional media and persons who are engaged in mass media, and has the vital potential to reach greater public and audience. There is still a wide gap which needs to be reduced. Hope you all enjoyed this lecture. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the questions at the end. Thank you.